Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And before we dive into today's episode, we just want to touch on a relatively big change to the podcast that you may have missed if you don't follow us on social media. Last week, we announced that we're going to be changing our upload schedule from weekly to bi-weekly. We have a lot going on in other areas of our lives lately, and due to the additional responsibilities on our shoulders, we decided it was time to make a change. We never want the quality of our content to suffer due to time constraints in our personal lives, and everyone's story that we cover on this show deserves the same time and effort you've become accustomed to, and we refuse to put out lesser quality content because it's rushed. We thank all of you for your support over the past year and a half and hope you understand why we felt compelled to make this change. But without further ado, in today's episode, we'll be discussing the case of a young mother who dropped her daughter off at her parents' house one night to go out on a date, but she never returned. 5 months later, her skull was found in a remote area over 30 miles from where she was last seen. Although there hadn't been much detailed reporting in the early days of this case, renewed interest in the past decade has pushed it into the public eye again. But in order for this case to be solved, authorities feel as though someone who knows something must speak up. Today's case is about the murder of Elizabeth Berquist. Elizabeth Jane Berquist, also endearingly known as Betty Jane or BJ by her loved ones and friends, was born on January 7, 1953 to parents George and Minnie, and as far as siblings go, she had one brother who was about 6 years older than her named George Jr. Unfortunately, there isn't much out there about Elizabeth's early life, but by the time 1977 rolled around, she was 24 years old and had a 2-year-old daughter named Tara. She and her daughter's father reportedly had a rather on-again, off-again relationship, and by December of 1977, that relationship appeared to be off. At the time, Elizabeth had been working as a nurse at the McKeesport Hospital, and she'd been employed there for a little over a year as she'd landed the job back in '76 after she'd finished her schooling at the Allegheny Community College of Nursing that previous June. Prior to the completion of her training, she'd worked at a local restaurant called Canopy Restaurant, which I assume helped her to pay her way through college. Elizabeth was described as a fun-loving, outgoing, and kind person who had a ton of friends, and pretty much everyone that knew her loved her, and she was also said to be a fantastic and very devoted mother. Now, on Thursday, December 15th, 1977, Elizabeth had been back to work after a short leave of absence, and she was actually supposed to have that Thursday off, as well as the following day, actually, but she decided she'd pick up a shift to make a little extra cash, since, of course, it was the holiday season. Her daughter Tara was 2 years old at the time, and this was the first Christmas that she would really grasp the magic of it all, so Elizabeth had gotten her a bunch of gifts and was all ready and set to go. She had them wrapped and was just so excited to see her child's eyes light up on Christmas morning, and I can assume she just wanted to save up some extra money after probably spending a fair amount to give her daughter that magical Christmas experience. But after Elizabeth had gotten out of work that day, the 15th, she'd headed over to her parents' house located at 605 Robin Road in Elizabeth Township, Pennsylvania, which was only a short distance from where she and her daughter lived at 924 Seneca Court in the Greenock section of the same township, and she lived in building number 5, apartment 6 there. Unfortunately, though, I've been unable to locate Elizabeth's parents' home at 605 Robin Road, and I have a feeling it either no longer exists or maybe the street name changed. I've searched a couple-mile radius around Seneca Court on Google Maps and can't locate any streets with a similar name, but regardless, based on all reporting, Elizabeth did not live too far from her parents' residence, so I just kind of wanted to put that out there. Elizabeth had gotten out of work and was still dressed in her nurse's uniform when she'd brought Tara over to her parents and stayed and had dinner with them. After they spent a little while together, Elizabeth was planning to leave Tara there with her grandparents for the night and head out on a date. She told her mom and dad she would be back in the morning, and off she went to go home and change and get ready. At the time, Elizabeth did not tell her parents who she was going on this date with, but it was later revealed that she was planning on going out with a man she worked with at the hospital. The following morning came and went, and Elizabeth still hadn't come back to her parents' residence to pick up her daughter, and she hadn't contacted anyone either, not any of her family nor her friends. So that day, her brother decided to take a quick drive over to her house to attempt to check on her. He told the Pittsburgh Press at the time, quote, "It got to be late Friday, and she didn't come or call, so I took a drive over to her place and didn't see her car. We thought she decided to work again," end quote.
As she was picking up extra shifts because it's close to the holidays, understandable. But weird that she wouldn't have contacted anybody and been like, "Hey, I'm picking up another shift. Do you mind watching Tara?"
Yeah, exactly. But I always try and put myself in that mindset. Like, this is 45 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that just was common. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think that's a stretch. Like,
yeah.
If you're supposed to come pick up your daughter, you would at least make a phone call and say, "Oh, I'm going into work instead. Do you mind watching her?"
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely odd, but I don't know how much of a cause for concern it was just yet at this point anyway.
Fair enough.
But before we move on, I do just want to bring this one thing up, just in case our listeners maybe, I don't know, do research or like look into these cases on their own after they listen to our episode, or maybe they already know about the case before they're listening to our episode on it. But there is a big discrepancy that I've seen regarding the specific date in question of when Elizabeth was last seen, and that's whether it was December 15th or the 17th. And there's actually a surprising amount of reporting that stated that the date was the 17th, but based on the sources I feel are the most reliable, and also more recent comments from loved ones and authorities, I believe that Thursday the 15th is the accurate date of when Elizabeth was last seen.
Last seen by family members, like when she dropped Tara off to her parents.
Correct, yep. Now, based on a missing persons flyer from the Elizabeth Township PD that's available to view online, it looks as though the family officially reported her missing a few days later on December 19th, 1977, after they discovered that she also hadn't made it to a shift at work on Saturday that she was scheduled for, and that day was the 17th. So I have to assume that they were likely hoping for the best, but by this point they were fearful of what could have happened to her, and they finally called police. But once the report was filed, the Elizabeth Township Police Department would take the lead in the investigation, and officers with the PD made a trip over to Elizabeth's apartment to check on things and see if she might have been inside. When they arrived, a few things were uncovered. So, when authorities first got to the apartment door, they discovered that it was locked, and upon entry to the apartment, they located her purse, her car keys, her coat, all of her clothing, and they also found her nurse's uniform on the bed, which is what she'd been wearing when she had dinner at her parents' house and had left Tara there for the night. Investigators noted that there was no sign of forced entry and no struggle that appeared to have taken place within the unit. And I do also just want to mention that I find it to be particularly odd that the door was locked, yet her keys were found inside the apartment. Which begs the question, did this person have a key of their own if somebody else was involved here? Or did she have a key outside of the unit and somebody else knew where that was and used it to maybe lock up behind them?
That, or I would wonder what the locking mechanism is for the door.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if it's one of those doors where you can leave it locked on the inside all the time? You unlock it from the outside.
Yeah.
And it's not really like flipping the lock to unlocked. It's just unlocking and turning the knob at the same time.
Yeah.
You come in and then it's still locked on the outside. Am I explaining that right?
Yeah, we used to have a door like that on the house when we first moved into
Yes.
it. I remember that. But then that makes me question, what reason would she have had to have left the unit knowing that the door was locked from the inside? Like, say she was going to go bring out
leave her
trash.
keys.
Yeah, to like throw trash in the dumpster, but her keys are still in the unit. How would she be able to get back in there?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. That's a question you'd like to know more about the locking mechanism to really narrow down, because if the door was locked, like say it was a deadbolt, right?
Yeah.
You can only lock that with a key or from the inside.
Exactly.
So that would be useful information to know.
Absolutely. And if there's like no struggle in there, but yet like all her stuff is there, it's also...
All her stuff's there, but she also dropped Tara off at her parents. So you must assume that she went back to the house to get ready for the date.
Which she did. Her nurse's uniform is on the bed, so she obviously got changed. But what would prompt her to leave, but also not leave with a coat? Because it's literally 10 days before Christmas in Pennsylvania. It's cold.
Yeah, my head always goes to like other cases that we've talked about. And it's so bad because you can give me the name of a case or the name of a victim and I can't remember anything, but we'll talk about a particular, scene or
a detail
of a case, and it'll make me connect to another case. And then I'll be like, oh, it was that case, or, oh, it was that person in that case.
Well, I think that's because you have a hard time with names.
Yeah.
Like you're good with faces and you can remember people
Faces,
and then you're
places,
like, who is that?
Things like that.
Yeah.
But just talking about her apartment and stuff like that, I'm thinking Jennifer Kesse.
Okay, yep. That's
because
a good
the apartment's
comparison.
kind of, lived in, but not totally
disheveled.
Destroyed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely strange. So her uniform was there. Her keys were there. Was there like an outfit? Is that what you had talked about? Was there an outfit that
her
she was
uniform
supposed to be?
was
Okay,
left
just the
on
uniform.
The bed.
Okay.
Yep.
So it appears as though she probably changed out of the uniform into whatever date clothes she was going to be wearing.
Yep.
But her keys were still there.
And her purse, her coat, everything's
her
there.
Car?
Her car hadn't been there when her brother went to go check the day before.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into some more things that were found, though.
All right.
So let's keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, due to the fact that the last thing she'd been seen wearing had been left in the apartment, there was very little to go off of in terms of alerting the public of what Elizabeth might have been wearing. So all they really were able to put out was her appearance. So they described her as being 5 feet 4 inches tall, 105 pounds, with brown hair, brown eyes, and a fair complexion.
Did they put out any vehicle information? I know you said that we're going to get into that in a minute, but you know that she's potentially missing. Her keys are there and her car's not. So when you're talking to police, you would think, okay, this is what she looks like. We don't know what she was wearing, but her car's also not there. And that's weird.
We'll dive into that in just a minute. I know you have questions, and I promise I will answer them. But first, I actually have a couple pictures that I wanted to send over to you. So the first being just a few of Elizabeth, so you can have a visual of what she looks like in your head while we're talking. Then I have a copy of that missing persons flyer I just mentioned a few minutes ago as well. Then I have a photo of the outside of the apartment complex where she lived and the front door of her unit specifically. And lastly, I do also have a Google Maps street view of her building, obviously from recent years, but you can see the building as a whole and kind of toggle around Google Maps to take a peek at it.
All right.
What's weird about her pictures is that in some, she doesn't even look the same. Like her haircut, depending on what her hair looked like at the time, totally changed her look.
Yeah, it definitely does. I would say there's one where she's wearing like the striped sweater and the collared shirt.
Yeah.
With her daughter on her lap.
Mm-hmm.
That one, even some of her facial structure looks a little different.
Yeah, I agree.
Like
I
her
almost
nose.
feel like it's the way like her head's turned.
And probably lighting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But no, I was looking at the Google Maps and I still have like the image view up of the street view. But then I was looking at the map as well. And I was like, how the hell do you even say that river's name?
Oh, hold on. I don't have it up.
Yohia Jenny River.
What? Hold on. Let me get there.
Yohanachini River?
Oh my God. How do you say that?
Yoanoini? Yoio-Henny River. Yoio-Henny River.
Yoio-Henny.
Yoio-Henny River, I think is what it is.
Wow.
But yeah, I was just looking because I wanted to see, okay, are there bodies of water nearby? Just like weird stuff.
Yeah,
Because we don't even know where the story is going yet, but just wanted to see the general landscape of the place.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yep.
All right, you ready to keep going?
Yes.
Let's get back to what Elizabeth may have been wearing the night she vanished. What was probably really frustrating for her family is that her parents, just unfortunately, couldn't have had any idea of what she could have possibly worn that night. But interestingly, at least according to early reporting on the case, investigators had asked several of Elizabeth's close girlfriends to come to the apartment and have a quick look through her clothes to see if they could identify anything at all that may have been missing. And the only item that I ever saw described in the media as potentially being missing was a brown leather coat.
Okay. Makes sense. Brown leather on a cold winter's night.
Not warm, though. Like, that's not a warm coat, but maybe that's a date night coat.
Yeah. I mean, a leather jacket can be warm.
Depending.
It's not like a puffy Columbia winter jacket or something, but...
True. But okay, we're actually going to now answer your question from a few minutes ago.
With the car.
Yes. Outside of the apartment, authorities were actually able to locate Elizabeth's vehicle. even though her brother had said he couldn't locate it when he'd taken a drive by the apartment on Friday the 16th. But as it turns out, her car was actually found parked on the side of the apartment building, which is not where she would normally park it. Her usual spot was in the front. So at this point in the investigation, authorities weren't saying that foul play was definitely at hand, but due to the circumstances involved and Elizabeth's devotion to her daughter, this was completely out of character for her, and she likely did not take off on her own. So, regardless of if police were saying it right off the bat or not, it did appear as though they were taking things seriously and felt as though she could have met with foul play.
Yeah, and I mean, you know that family and friends are thinking that too.
Absolutely.
Because they know her character.
Yes. Now, due to the belief that foul play could have been and more than likely was involved, I have a few questions about Elizabeth's car in particular. And I have a sneaking suspicion that, John, you probably have a lot of the same questions in your head that I do. And the first thing that stood out to me when I was initially researching this case was, why would her car be in a different spot than where she would normally park it if she was the one driving it? Of course, there's always the innocuous answer that, I don't know, maybe there were no spaces available and that's the only place that she could find to park. But that's not what came to mind for me.
That's what came to mind for me.
Okay,
Funny enough, just because like you're in an apartment complex, right? People might be having guests over. They're like, oh, I'm going to such and such's house. I'm going to park in whatever spot's available.
Yeah.
Not thinking, oh, maybe this is where a resident usually parks. Maybe it's not marked at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So my first instinct was, okay, maybe she parked over there, went into the house because her normal spot was taken.
Yes, but then that makes me wonder, did her brother come to the complex, drove around, didn't see the car? For all we know, this couldn't have been reported publicly and may have happened. What if the car just wasn't there at all and he actually drove around and was like, no, it was not on the side of the building. No, it was not in the front of the building. It was not anywhere. And maybe the car wasn't put back there until later.
Yeah.
So I think that's a possibility too.
Because whoever returned it may not park it where she normally parked.
Exactly.
But then you would want to go into the vehicle and you would want to see like seat position and stuff like that. So
yes, so those are...
She's short. She's what, 5'4"?
Yeah, so those are some of my other questions. But I do want to say that because of where the car was parked, I had thought it's very possible that somebody else could have put this car there.
It is possible, yes.
Yeah, and her family had stated early on as well that they also believed that somebody else could have driven the car, parked it in that obscure spot, and then who knows if it got there later or George Jr. just missed it or whatever happened. So they were skeptical as well.
Right. That's at that point, just to rule that out, I would canvass the neighbors
Mm-hmm.
and I would say, hey, did you have any people over last night? And then get in touch with those people or ask the residents, did you know where they parked? Do you know if they parked in front of the building? Do you know what the parking situation was? Just go and ask these people because they'll probably answer. It's not like you have to tell them what it is you're investigating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. But then the other things that I wanted to know have to do with what you just mentioned before. What did the car look like? Obviously, you mentioned the driver's seat. Was that pushed back further to accommodate a taller individual? What about the outside of the car, too? Was it muddy? Were the tires full of grass? And then back on the inside of the car, were there footprints on the floor? That made me think of Jennifer Kessie's case, too.
Yeah.
Or were there footprints on the mats? Mud or grass or debris or something there? What about the back seat? What about the trunk? What kind of things did investigators find in this car?
Yeah.
And I'm asking all these questions because, sadly, these are all things that I was unable to find details on. And I truly have no idea what kind of potential forensic testing may have been done on the car back then, especially considering this was 77 and DNA wasn't even a thing yet. But I am curious about fingerprints. Did they test the windows, the crank for the window on the door, or the steering wheel, the radio, things like that? Were they able to pull any prints, and were there prints in there that did not belong to Elizabeth?
Right. Or did they find any hair? Because I know the DNA wasn't a thing, but they were doing the hair test back then, right?
Yep.
And they were just testing to see if it was similar, not testing for DNA, but comparing.
That's possible. That's
yeah,
a
it's good to wonder or good to ask the question what forensic testing was done.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, moving right along. Once authorities discovered all that they did at the apartment complex and within Elizabeth's unit, they gathered as many men as they could and began searching the area. the chief of the Elizabeth Township PD at the time, a man named George Berquist, so there are actually a lot of Georges in this case, try not to get them confused. We've got the dad, the brother, and the chief of police.
Yeah.
But he'd reached out to the Allegheny County Police Department to get advice on what to do and kind of just how to tackle an investigation like this. And the head of the Allegheny County Homicide Task Force, Sheriff Eugene Kuhn, along with the force itself, did get involved in the investigation and the search for the now missing 24-year-old mother. So by this point, it was an all-hands-on-deck situation with multiple agencies getting involved, and a search of the 23-square-mile township began. Many officers with other departments, as well as volunteers with the Boston Volunteer Fire Co. and civilian volunteers got together to thoroughly comb the area for any sign of Elizabeth or any clues at all that might lead them to her whereabouts.
Was there a Boston, Pennsylvania?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm thinking Boston, Mass. I'm like, wow.
No, there's a
Really
Boston,
reaching out there.
Pennsylvania, and I actually just saw it on that map that we were looking at of where that very strange river name is. But there was also reporting that even culverts and drain pipes were being searched, and honestly, not one section of town was being overlooked when it came to these searches. But within several days, there was nothing found that might indicate where Elizabeth was. So by now, I feel like you might be thinking about a couple of different things, or maybe a couple different people that I brought up earlier. One of which being the on-again, off-again boyfriend, and the other most likely being the guy that Elizabeth was supposed to be going on a date with the night of Thursday, December 15th.
More that person than the on-again, off-again boyfriend.
Okay, so I'm going to give you at least a few details on the date right now, and then a little while later we'll dive into more information I've been able to locate regarding the father of Elizabeth's child.
Okay.
So in terms of the date, as I mentioned before, this guy had apparently been a fellow employee. And authorities with the Elizabeth Township PD did end up tracking that man down, and specifically they wanted to know if he'd ever met up with Elizabeth that night, and likely also would have wanted details about what she was wearing, how she was acting, if he did in fact see her. But to investigators' disappointment, that man stated he hadn't seen Elizabeth that night. But it's honestly pretty unclear exactly what happened with their date in general. I don't know if she didn't show up or if either of them had called and canceled the date at the last minute, but I do want to bring up that I saw one and only one report that this guy had quote-unquote broken the date with her, which would make me think that he did cancel at the last minute.
Yep. Or at least at some point.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, all I really feel like I know for sure is that this guy said that he did not see Elizabeth the night of Thursday, December 15th.
Which could mean two things. Either he actually did break off the date with her ahead of time, or he's deflecting and trying to remove himself from any type of wrongdoing.
Yeah, both are absolutely possible. And authorities were kind of taking this statement with a grain of salt, as it was reported that this man was, quote, expected to submit himself to further police questioning, end quote.
Okay.
So they were like, we don't know how much we believe that you didn't see her. So obviously they were probably, going to scrutinize his story a bit more, figure out his alibi, find out what was going on. Because if she had gone to her parents' house for dinner, likely around like 4 or 5 o'clock.
Yeah, but if she got home and then checked the voicemail.
Okay, that's possible, true.
That's probably how he would have contacted her.
Yes, and left the voicemail. When she gets home, she listens to it, whatever.
Right. So from my perspective, when you were talking about, okay, we probably have two people that you're thinking about, it only makes sense that the first person to come to your mind would be the person that she was planning to go out with that night, right? Because what are the odds that not only was she planning to go out on this date with this person, but also, the on-again, off-again boyfriend just so happened to come on this day when she's supposed to go out with somebody and did something nefarious at that time. Is it possible? Yeah. Yes, but first you want to rule out with the person that she planned to see that night.
I completely agree. Absolutely. Now, despite the fact that this guy she was supposed to go on a date with claimed he did not see her the night she disappeared, that didn't mean that authorities weren't going to ask around and see if anybody else had seen her. So they started by asking residents of the complex she lived in if any of them had noticed her that night. And based on what I can find, some people had spotted her, but only coming home and going into her apartment. From what I can tell, at least based on reporting, no one saw her leaving. That is, unless that's something authorities know and are keeping to themselves, but I would find it particularly odd if they had a description of who she may have been seen with or what she was last seen wearing and just not provide that information to the public.
Yeah, I don't think that they would withhold that information. I think that something else that popped into my head, because I know we're talking through potential suspects and the on-again, off-again boyfriend, and I was thinking about how the door was locked. You know, if this on-again, off-again boyfriend had a key to the apartment, could he have made his way in there and he had been laying in wait? She came home, locked the door behind her, went and played the voicemail or whatever, and maybe he could have attacked her at that point. And then instead of leaving through the door where everybody would see him, if, you know, there was another window or a second way out of the apartment.
Ingress and egress, so you have to have two ways in or out.
Yeah, so that was just something that popped into my head. I know that it seems like we're dismissing the guy that she was supposed to go out on a date with fairly completely at this point.
Yeah.
Like, he's still going to be questioned and everything, but if he didn't go out on a date with her and nobody saw him with her, and how would he have access to the apartment?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Now you're moving on to the other person. It's like, okay, well, he could have had a key. He could have been in there, and then she came home, locked the door, or whatever. But
yeah,
let's continue on with what you're talking about and not my random thoughts.
Just keep it in the back of your head, because I promise we'll touch on him later on.
All right.
Now, oddly enough, Elizabeth's case was not the first disappearance that had taken place in southwestern Pennsylvania that year, and more specifically, in the 2 months prior to her going missing. So it was reported that there were 3 other women and girls who vanished under mysterious circumstances since October of 1977. I'll tell you right off the bat, I don't believe there's a connection between any of these cases and Elizabeth's, but 2 of these cases I am going to tell you about in just a second did appear to be connected to each other.
Pennsylvania, man.
I know. Regardless of if there's a connection to Elizabeth's case or not, I still think it's important to bring up these other cases, as it kind of goes to the mindset and how the area might have been feeling at the time with so much violent crime happening. So the first disappearance took place in late October of 1977 in Findlay Township, Pennsylvania, which was about an hour drive from where Elizabeth went missing. 17-year-old John Feely and 15-year-old Renee Greger were on a date when John was shot and killed and Renee was abducted. And authorities later found John deceased in his van in a very remote area.
Like a lover's lane type thing?
Kind of, yeah, that's what I was thinking. The second case took place sometime in mid-November, so a couple weeks later, this time in Fallston, Pennsylvania, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Elizabeth Township, and a man named William Adams was killed in his trailer by a shotgun blast to the chest, and his wife, Nancy Adams, was abducted, and I do believe her body was later found. And then, on November 23rd, 1977, a 6-year-old girl named Beth Lynn Barr, who was the daughter of a police officer, was kidnapped by a man in a car on her way home from school. Her body was found about a year and a half later, and it was determined she'd been stabbed to death. Now, I did a bit of research into all 3 of these cases, and I found that Nancy and William Adams' case, as well as Renee Greger and John Feely's, were connected. A man by the name of Edward Surratt, or Surratt, I don't really know how you say it, but he's a convicted serial killer, so who cares? He actually confessed to both of those crimes. Nancy's body had been found, but Renee's never has been, and according to reporting done on these cases, this guy that confessed, or kind of confessed, because we later find out that his confessions were quote-unquote vague, but he stated that Renee's body was unrecoverable. But, because of the fact that his confessions were kind of vague, he wasn't charged, at least for Renee and John's cases. And then you've got Beth Lynn Barr's case, and that was supposedly on the brink of being solved back in 2021, but I haven't found any more recent reporting as of today in May of 2023. But I do feel like, and I'm bringing this up to you now, John, because I feel like we got a message from one of our listeners, and I can't seem to find it, that they suggested this case to us of Beth Lynn Barr. Does that sound familiar to you?
Well, Beth Lynn Barr.
And I was like, oh, that's a big case out of Pennsylvania. And I know you made a comment because of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, probably because there are so many freaking wild cases that come out of Pennsylvania.
It's probably like one of our most covered states.
Yes.
It's crazy.
But it's not ringing an immediate bell, but now that you're saying that you made a comment to me, and then I was like, oh, Pennsylvania again, and if you had said that it's a big case.
Yeah. So if this was you, listener, that sent this to me, please resend your message so I can know who it was that suggested the case, because I am interested in it, and I would like to take a peek at it and maybe cover it in the future. So, all right, you ready to keep moving on?
I was born ready.
Okay, so there was actually quite a lull in media attention for Elizabeth's case for about 5 months.
So I don't want to cut you off.
Okay.
But we've really heard, and I know this is an older case, 77, but we haven't really heard anything about an investigation.
There's an investigation going on, but there are not a lot of details on it.
Okay. So we know that the brother went there, couldn't find her, never saw the car, whether it be parked in her spot or on the side. And then police began their investigation. That's really all we have.
Yeah, there's a lot of like behind the scenes stuff. And even today, with recent interviews with detectives on the case, they're still not giving a lot. No.
Okay. So, let's try to get to something then.
Yes, let's. Okay. So by early May of 78, there was an influx of new articles regarding the fact that about 2 weeks prior, so back on April 15th, 1978, a woman's skull was found in Hawkins Hollow, which was off Route 711 in Springfield Township, and was described as a quote-unquote poverty pocket and was a relatively desolate area. On that day, April 15th, a 73-year-old retired man who lived alone named James Grimm had come out onto his property and saw that 2 of his dogs were playing with a skull in his yard. He immediately called state police at Uniontown, and according to reporting done for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, quote, "The skull was turned over to state police in Uniontown by James L. Grimm, 73, who lives in a shack-like wooden home located on a winding, desolate dirt road that affords the only way in or out of Hawkins Hollow," end quote.
Now I understand the term poverty pocket.
Does it have to do with the shack-like wooden home terminology?
Yep, in a desolate area.
Yeah, so I think, and I wanted to read that for you too, because I thought it was a particularly interesting comment, more so about the road, the fact that it's affording the only way in or out.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that this skull, regardless of who it belongs to, is found here.
I wonder how long you have to travel down that road to get to this area if you're considering it as the only way in or out. Like if you could make your way into, what is it, Hawkins Hollow? Man, when I hear Hawkins, all I think of is Stranger Things.
That's exactly what I was thinking of when I was researching this.
But like, what if you walk through the woods? Is it like a 1/4-mile walk through the woods? And you can get in there, but the only road that brings you in
is that one
is
road.
that one, but
it's very possible.
It could mean nothing, so.
All right, so a few weeks after the skull was found, it was reported publicly that based on dental record comparisons, the skull did belong to Elizabeth Berquist.
Interesting.
But at that point, no other bones had been located, only the skull was found. And because Elizabeth's case had now crossed county lines, and there had already been multiple jurisdictions involved, the state police at Uniontown took over the investigation. But Fayette County Police, as well as the Elizabeth Township Police, were still assisting with the investigation. Now, authorities did bring up the fact that they were surprised of the location where Elizabeth's skull had been located because it was relatively far from her home. And I looked it up, and the distance from where she'd lived on Seneca Court in Elizabeth Township to Hawkins Hollow was about 35 miles southeast, or a 45 to 50-minute drive. So that is definitely not around the corner. You don't need to look that up right now because I am going to send you a link in a second. But you have to think that whoever brought her there drove a fair distance. And I personally feel like they might have even specifically chosen this location. And I have to tell you, after looking up where Hawkins Hollow Road is and the town itself, they weren't kidding when they said it's desolate and remote. There are not very many houses there, and the ones that are certainly not very close together. And just looking at Google Maps, which, John, I'm going to send to you in just a second, it is very, very rural.
So I know you're going to send it to me in a second, but I already looked it up.
Hawkins Hollow Road.
Hawkins Hollow Road. And I have to say, I find it a bit ironic that Pennsylvania has a place called Normalville.
Yes, I was just going to get into Normalville in a few minutes. Yeah.
I don't want to steal your thunder, so I won't talk any more about it.
No, I was just going to talk about how there were volunteers from Normalville.
Okay. So Hawkins Hollow Road, try and say that 3 times fast.
I know.
No large bodies of water nearby, so I wouldn't say that, her body was thrown into a body of water.
Mm-hmm. And to find that in this area too.
Right. But I'm saying, like, if you had a big river that ran all the way through and then it washed up on the bank and the dogs are just out running around and they find it and then they bring it back.
Well, yeah, like the Susquehanna River or something like that. We talk about that often because that is a very large body of water in Pennsylvania and multiple other states.
Right. Unless these dogs are running pretty far away to the Yowie-Henny River, which is south of Hawkins Hollow Road.
Yeah, that's the only...
I think that's a bit of a stretch, and it is strange that this 45 to 50-minute drive out to a super desolate place is where her skull was found.
Yeah.
My first instinct is like, okay, how did this skull travel here? And you're generally going to guess, okay, a body of water maybe?
Yeah.
It's not like it's blowing like a tumbleweed.
Mm-hmm. Or the other option is someone specifically brought her here and left her body or buried her body somewhere in
this desolate place.
Yeah, there's so much tree coverage. I mean, and you would have to think that it was probably placed somewhere near this man's property on Hawkins Hollow Road.
Yes. So my question is the fact that there's only one road leading in and out of this area, does that end up being significant in this investigation yet?
I don't know. It might, but we might not know about it.
All right.
So
let's move on then.
Okay, so in terms of how Elizabeth's family was doing once they were made aware of the news, the Pittsburgh Press reported, quote, Berquist, grieved by the news of his daughter's death, said in a phone interview last night that his wife is taking it pretty hard. We kind of expected it, but it's still a shock, he said. Tara has been missing her every day. The grandparents have not yet told the child that Miss Berquist will not be coming to pick her up. We haven't decided yet when we're going to tell her, Berquist said. We haven't decided anything yet, end quote. Within days of her skull being found, authorities put together another massive search effort in an attempt to find other bones that may have belonged to her, which they were hoping could potentially lead to a determination on her cause of death. Searches were done by 60-plus firefighters from multiple towns, including Salt Lick Township, Springfield Township, and, as John mentioned, Normalville.
Normalville.
Yes. After a short time, though, no other bones were located in the area. The following statement was reported regarding the lack of findings during those searches. Quote, they can't be sure if the victim was deliberately decapitated and her head and the remainder of her corpse disposed of in different locations to prevent identification, or if the entire body was hidden somewhere in desolate Hawkins Hollow, end quote.
It's pretty morbid to put out.
Yes, it is.
But factual.
Yes, I think it is necessary because it's something to question.
Yes, and it's always a fine line that you have to walk.
Mm-hmm.
Are you putting out gruesome but factual details, or are you placating to people's feelings and you're only putting out stuff that won't offend somebody?
Yeah.
And even I was taken aback as, oh, wow, that's pretty graphic to put out.
Mm-hmm.
I think that putting out gruesome but factual information is always better than withholding information.
I completely agree. And then that could also go into if someone knew about it, like if someone made a comment to them like, oh, I've decapitated someone before, you know, and they're like, oh, well, this guy I used to know threatened me saying he did this to somebody else, you know, that could be something that could bring in a tip or a lead. So I think it is necessary. I will completely agree with you there.
Yep.
I do want to say, too, that there was one other thing that was found, but I don't know exactly when. It was found early in May, or it might have even been found several days after the skull was found, but the reporting was done in early May of 78, that about 400 yards from where Elizabeth's skull had been found on the 15th of April, there had been a small patch of hair located that was determined to also belong to her. So I would have to assume that it was probably 400 yards from where the dogs were playing with the skull in the yard.
Yeah, because there's no way that the owner of the dogs would know where the dogs found it.
Exactly, yeah. So that was the only...
So it must have been 400 yards from the guy's property.
Probably, yeah. So then they located her skull and a tuft of her hair.
And I wonder if that tuft of hair has been preserved and they're testing it most recently and they have some type of DNA to connect it to her, because I had mentioned before with the car...
Hair evidence, yeah.
Was, is this a similar type of hair?
Yeah.
It's not, hey, the hair... or the DNA from this hair sample is this person.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know how exact that claim is as to this is her hair.
Agreed, yeah. Then, shockingly, a few days after the hair and skull were found, another gruesome discovery was made. this time in German Township, which was about 25 miles southwest of Hawkins Hollow and nearly 40 miles south of Elizabeth Township. So on or around May 10th, 1978, a scalp with auburn hair was discovered by a man named either Solomon or Sullivan Angelo in a barn on his property, and it was believed a cat had located it and brought it back to that area.
A tuft of hair?
A scalp with hair.
So we're talking like actual skin with
Correct.
hair attached to it.
Correct. And obviously, you know, it's standing out that dogs found the skull, a cat found the scalp, and officers weren't letting that go unnoticed. And one officer said, quote, "If only these animals could talk, our job would be a lot easier," end quote.
You need to bring in one of those pet psychics.
Oh my God, I know. Do you remember when I told you I followed one on Instagram before, and then I was like, oh God, I can't keep doing this anymore.
Shame. Ring the bell. Shame. Like Game of Thrones.
Yeah, that one was a little tough for me.
Yeah.
Now, the person that this scalp was believed to have belonged to, at least according to reporting done in the Pittsburgh Press at the time, was, quote, believed to be a white, middle-aged woman, end quote. Now, even though the hair was said to be auburn, it was later described as being a natural brown hair color mixed with a fair amount of grays. And because the hair was dyed, authorities immediately believed it belonged to a female, and due to the grays, they believed the woman was middle-aged.
I don't believe it's Elizabeth's then.
Correct. So
I mean, even if it was not dyed and whatever, I mean, you're talking grays and a 24-year-old woman.
Exactly, yeah. And I was going to tell you in a minute, but you're right. It does not belong to Elizabeth. It was determined that it was not hers. But
it's so bizarre that, like, in a same general area, you've got a tuft of hair, you've got a skull, you've got a scalp and hair.
Yeah, and then you have
found.
all these other cases as well in the area. So you had all the things that were happening in late 77. Then you don't have too much. But then April and May, it's all of a sudden these horrible, gruesome discoveries.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is never ending. There's so many horrible things happening around here.
Yeah.
So the scalp located was said to be rather large in size and was around 7 square inches. And the ME stated that it was more than likely removed within the past 3 to 4 months when it was found, and it came from the crown of the deceased individual's head. Authorities confirmed that whoever this scalp belonged to was deceased because, quote, they said you wouldn't be walking around with that much scalp missing, end quote.
All right, you'd probably be gushing blood out of your head.
Yes.
At that point. I mean, especially from the crown, you think, like, all of your blood kind of goes to the peak of your head.
Well, head wounds always bleed more.
So, hear me out. And I think I've told you this story before, but I was demoing an old store at one point, and I used a sledgehammer, I broke something, and part of it came back and hit my head, and I wasn't wearing a hard hat. And it didn't even hurt, but it got a little nick in my forehead, like right at my hairline, and then I just started like gushing blood.
Pouring,
and I was like, what the hell happened? But yeah, I mean, so imagine 7 square inches of your scalp missing.
Yeah, you're not
walking around like that.
I don't think you're surviving that. Exactly. So
not without quick medical attention.
Yes, agreed. But then after additional searches of that area to find any additional body parts or bones or anything, it didn't appear as though authorities found anything to point to who that woman had been, any other remains, and by the latter half of 78, whoever the woman was whose scalp that belonged to had still not been identified, and I don't believe they ever found any additional remains. I went through tons of newspaper articles for like a full decade after 78 and could not find anything. Also, as mentioned before, there had been a fair amount of violent crime in the area in late 77, and the same went for 78. Obviously, we know Elizabeth went missing in December of 77, her skull was located in 78, then the hair and the scalp in May, and then by September, there was another murder that took place in the area, and this time it was a man who had been unidentified at the time of reporting, but he was shot at least twice with wounds to the chest, neck, and back. And this just goes back to how John and I always talk about Pennsylvania is just insane.
It is.
I'm not like knocking Pennsylvania and like people that live there or anything, but there are so many cases out of Pennsylvania. And I feel like I always hear people say like, oh my God, Washington is so sketchy. Don't go to Washington. Like, no, man, don't go to Pennsylvania.
I can't believe you planned a vacation for us there at one point.
I don't even want to talk about that. That's the worst experience of my life.
We went to the Poconos.
No, we didn't. We went to some obscure town outside of the Poconos that closed at like everywhere closed at like 7 o'clock at night.
6 o'clock at night, I think we were driving around and everything was like, oh, close at 7, close at 7.
It was so cringe.
And
I think we went in like January.
Army.
Yes. Oh my God. I remember that. We were buying such random shit in there.
Yeah.
Ugh. All right. So anywho, I'm sure at this point, with all this talk about other horrific discoveries in the area, you likely want me to circle back to Elizabeth's skull that was found and tell you if it showed any injuries that may have indicated how she died. Well, it was reported that the state of her skull did not necessarily point to a cause or manner of death, but it was reported that there was a small fracture found on it, at least based on the initial review of her skull. And the Allegheny County Coroner's Office was planning to have more tests performed to see if they could determine anything else that could lead them to a more concrete manner and cause of death.
Well, I only wonder, they put out the fact that they cannot discount the idea that she may have been decapitated and the skull was placed somewhere and the body another place. Is that a clue as to information that they had uncovered?
Maybe. Possible, yeah.
Sure, we have a small mark on the skull, which may indicate something else or provide more information. But if they released that, is that what they think, and is that where they're going with their press release?
Good point. So now, fast forward about a week-ish after the original reporting on the skull. So by May 12th at this point, authorities along with the Allegheny County Coroner's Office had ruled Elizabeth's death as a homicide. And they'd also had the Fayette County Coroner's Office complete additional tests on her skull. And I think that's what led them to this declaration. And based on that secondary review, it was determined that there were, quote, traumatic fractures in the skull, end quote. And the coroner for Fayette County, Cyril Wecht, stated, quote, inasmuch as the remainder of Miss Berquist's body has not yet been recovered, it is not possible to determine whether she may have also sustained other specific injuries and wounds. He added, however, that the location of the skull, the finding of skull fractures, and other investigative data support the conclusion that Miss Berquist's death is a homicide, end quote. So then that makes me wonder, because of course, like in this article that I got this quote from, it had said like, oh, it's unclear what the other investigative data is. And I wonder if that's that point you just brought up about the potential for decapitation or something like that. Do they have those clues that then led them to believe maybe the fractures weren't the definitive cause of death, but we think this was a homicide because of A, B, and C that we know that you don't?
Sure. I mean, I probably know more information now than people at the time knew. But I'm already thinking, okay, we had a woman who there's not a ton of stuff missing from her apartment. Her vehicle was found at least a short time after her disappearance at her apartment. The door was locked. Her keys were there. What are the odds that, you know, she put on that brown leather coat, walked 45 miles or whatever it was to this desolate place, died due to a skull fracture, and then her skull was found and the rest of her body wasn't? Like, clearly this is a homicide. Clearly this is a death with somebody else involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
So even without putting a lot of investigative information out there, you can just say it appears as though she went missing from her apartment. The best to our knowledge, at least. And then she was found, or at least part of her was found
almost
in a deceased
an hour
manner.
Away.
Right, an hour away. So clearly it's a homicide.
Absolutely.
I would say clearly it's a murder investigation.
Yes, for sure. So after Elizabeth's skull was located and her death investigation deemed a homicide, there was about a 7-year lapse in reporting on the case, which would unfortunately become a common occurrence. But come June of 1985, there was an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that said the chief at the time, Berkovich, was going to be bringing the case to the grand jury.
What?
Right? Like, that's exactly what I said.
We haven't even heard of suspects or,
nothing.
You know, persons of interest. We only know the two men, essentially, that were in her life from a romantic standpoint.
So you're 7 years later. There's obviously a bunch of stuff that's gone down behind the scenes that nobody knows about.
Jeez.
So it's totally unclear, though, who he thought was responsible, what was really even going on with the case, why he thought he had enough to bring it to the grand jury in general. But this article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that reported on the matter stated, quote, but Berkovich, who will not reveal what evidence will be presented to the state grand jury, which can take several months to investigate, will not give up on this one either, end quote. And when they say, you know, he won't give up on this one either, it's because this article was actually like more dedicated to the fact that he was really dogged in his attempt to solving another case in which he did solve. An individual was arrested, charged, and sentenced when that man pled guilty to the crime that Berkovich had gone after him for. So
this guy's a dog that's going to go after any bone that he's got.
Yes.
If it's a job that he's working or a case that he's investigating, he's going after it.
Exactly. So I wonder if that's, he's like, you know what? We've been busting
tenacious.
our butt. Yeah. Busting our butt for 7 years on this case. I want to bring it to the grand jury. But that was it. That was the only article I could find. No information about a grand jury being convened. No information about where the case stood, what was happening, literally nothing. Epic silence for decades.
Well, I thought that was coming because you just said, unfortunately, that becomes common occurrence here.
Exactly.
That there's long spans of time with no information.
Yeah.
But that's wild. I mean, you can have somebody that's tenacious in their investigative ability, but sometimes you can't solve something.
Correct.
Like there's always a missing link or whatever. But knowing that this guy already solved a case and that he's now trying to bring a grand jury into this one, for it to go radio silence for decades after this release
clearly means that they either didn't have enough to bring it,
or
when they brought it, they couldn't.
It.
Yeah, that's possible too.
So where do we jump to?
2013.
Oh my God.
I know.
85?
Yes.
To 13?
Yes.
We're talking almost 30 years?
Correct.
Wow. All right. So what happened in 13?
So in 2013, the Herald Standard did some reporting on the case, and they wrote a couple articles. They have probably the most comprehensive video interview I've been able to find on the case. They interviewed law enforcement. They interviewed Elizabeth's now grown daughter, Tara, who was about, I think, 38 when the interview took place. Obviously, it had been so many years. She's grown up now. And there was a fair amount of information that came out within these pieces that were written, the video, all that. So first of all, I do want to mention, from what I've gathered anyway, that there may have been some communication issues in the past due to upwards of 3 agencies having been involved and then state police taking over once it crossed county lines. So in 2013, those different agencies were talking about how they all wanted to get together and go over the quote-unquote logistics of the case. And in regards to that meeting, Officer Adam Blake of the Elizabeth Township PD stated, quote, "That's something I'd like to facilitate," said Blake, who noted departments had a harder time sharing information 35 years ago than they do today because of improvements in network technology, end quote. And it was so heartbreaking, but also nice to hear from Elizabeth's daughter and to just see how far she'd come since losing her mom. Her grandparents had raised her, and she had now been married. She had 4 children of her own back in 2013. And she talked a lot about how her grandparents never really discussed what happened to her mother with her. And she didn't really hold any sort of resentment towards them for that. She said they felt like they wanted to protect her from the horrific truth. But she did eventually ask questions about her mom once she was older, and kids in the area would ask her things or say things to her about her mom. But I guess the answers she received were kind of just straightforward, short and to the point. And it was just something that was so hard for them to talk about, because obviously this was their daughter that was murdered.
Their daughter and their granddaughter's mother.
Exactly.
So it's yes, it's hard for you to talk about from your own perspective, but it's also hard to deliver that to somebody that you love and have raised.
Exactly, yeah. And according to reporting done for WTAE, quote, "As Tara got older, she began learning her mother didn't just die. A lot of the kids grew up in that area and would make comments to me. I would try then to maybe ask questions. My grandmother was obviously still very hurt and upset about it, so she would very quickly dismiss those questions," end quote. So it was just one of those things that's just so hard for her.
Well, I think trying to look at it from the perspective of somebody, that's lost a loved one, it's once you've compartmentalized something and boxed it up in its little cube and placed it on its shelf.
Yeah.
It's hard to go and open that box and deliver that information to somebody who's also going to be affected by it. It's how do you do that? It just sucks all the way around. And sometimes it's easier to just not talk about it. But yeah, I mean, it's not a great place for them to be in, to have to deliver that information to their granddaughter. And it sucks for the granddaughter to be hearing about all this stuff. That, somebody that she went to school with's parents were like, "Oh, you need to be nice to that girl because her mother got murdered. She's raised by her grandparents," or something like that. So those are the types of comments and things that she's hearing from all of these.
But like, imagine
people
trying
at
to
school.
explain that too to like an 8-year-old. You know,
Right,
if she was
it's like-
25, it's easier to sit her down and have a conversation with her. But you know, she was asking those things when she was young.
Right, and I probably would have did the same thing as they did.
Yeah, it's
You want to try and shield people from pain.
It's very true, yeah. But the thing that was like so heartbreaking, I mean, it really all is heartbreaking any which way you look at it, but Minnie, Elizabeth's mom, had passed away in 2012, and she had been suffering from dementia for a number of years before she passed. But Tara said that the one thing she could never forget was what happened to her daughter. But mercifully, several months to a year before she passed, she did eventually forget. And Tara told the Herald Standard that it felt like this relief for her, that this burden had been taken from her grandmother before she died. And her grandfather George had also passed away many years prior, back in 1987. So, you know, her grandparents are gone, her mother is gone, and just to like see like how she's like standing on her feet, she's got her own life, she's doing so well. It was impressive to see.
Yeah. Back to like the whole dementia portion. How much does that suck?
That's horrible. Oh my God.
That you're forgetting all the things you want to remember, but the one thing you want to forget
is what's
is the
stuck
only
in
thing
your
that
head.
stays with you.
Yep.
And I understand why you use the term mercifully. But yeah, the whole situation, not a good place that you want to find yourself in.
Absolutely.
Obviously, losing somebody close to you, but then also having to answer those questions.
Yep. Now, by 2013, the lead detective on the case with the state police at Uniontown was Trooper John Marshall. He, too, had been interviewed by the Herald Standard for this series on Elizabeth's case, and he said in his interview that he felt like her body had more than likely been buried in the general area where her skull was found, and that the animals dug it up and found the skull and then brought it onto James Grimm's property.
That makes sense to me as well. That's what I would assume.
Agreed. He had also said, in terms of suspects, quote, "Do I have strong suspects in this case? Of course I do," end quote.
Well, who are they?
We'll never know.
I hope we do find out eventually.
I know. And it was also reported in 2013 that authorities had a person of interest all those years ago and just could never charge that individual.
But why not name them and put the heat on them and see what happens?
I don't know, but I think that that's probably the person that Berkovich wanted to convene the grand jury for.
It makes sense. I mean, if they had a person of interest all these years ago and there's no other people named as suspects or more people named as persons of interest, you would assume that that person of interest carried over to the time when that grand jury was convened, unless some random other tip dropped in and was like a bombshell and was like, no, it was this person that was last seen with her. So.
Yeah. Now, in reporting done around the same time as the Herald Standards, but this time it was by WTAE, they actually reposted the original coverage from 1977 that was aired on the news when Elizabeth had originally gone missing. And I just wanted to play that for you now, John, so you can just kind of get an idea of, you know, just what it was like in 77 when they reported on her initially going missing. I feel like you don't see that a lot, and it's really hard to find archives of original coverage. You can find newspapers, of course, but to find video footage is unique.
Yeah, that's like going to a library of the place where it happened and hoping that they have it on file somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
In post, I'll add this audio in so everybody listening can hear it as well.
Yes, and everyone can find in the show notes, I'll have the direct link to this. So if you wanted to watch the video yourself, you can watch it as well to see like what the outside of her apartment looked like. And, you know, there's more video coverage, obviously, of it. So.
The apartment of Elizabeth Jane Berquist, 24, is gaily decorated for Christmas, but there will be no happiness here this year. Elizabeth Jane has disappeared. She dropped out of sight last Thursday after leaving off her 2-year-old daughter at her parents'. She had a date, she said, but she hasn't been seen since. Police in Elizabeth Township have talked to many people. They've called in the Allegheny County Special Homicide Squad, and they've organized a massive search.
Well, we have volunteers out searching the wooded areas in every nook and cranny, and we have asked Gene Kuhn for some assistance, and he sent out a few investigators to help us interview people. Right now, we have talked to quite a few people, and we intend on talking to quite a few more.
Well, the presence of the county unit would indicate that you're leaning toward the foul play theory.
We're not ruling foul play out at this time.
Her lifestyle would indicate that she's not the type 2 runaway.
That is exactly right. She has been faithful to her child and has been a good employee.
All day today, volunteers from the township, Boston, and Buena Vista combed the wooded sections in the area where the young nurse lived. But so far, no signs, no clues, and no suspects. There's an ironic twist to the disappearance of B.J. Berquist. You may recall about a year ago, just about this time, 2 women out here were found dead. There is no connection. That was ruled murder-suicide. However, they lived within a half a mile of Miss Berquist, and they too were nurses at the same hospital. Al McDowell, Channel 4 Action News.
Okay,
I know you have thoughts.
that was wild, watching and listening to that.
I know. That's why it's like, it's always so interesting for me. Like, even though like some of the things he says are very insensitive,
Right.
you know, it's like just going back to the times and like feeling what it felt like then.
Yes,
To,
and
you know?
I'm freaking terrible at this. But you know what it made me think about?
Yeah.
It made me think about the news stations in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory interviewing people outside of
Yes!
the factory.
Oh
I
my
was
God,
like,
yes.
What the hell? Why is my brain going to this?
That's perfect. That's the
Yeah.
perfect description.
Oh, it's so wild. But
That was
yeah,
Berkovich,
it's-
I'm pretty sure.
okay, that was the investigator.
I think so.
The
I'm
chief?
not 100% sure, but I think it was him.
Yeah, I can't tell what's on the collar of his shirt, but he is wearing a white shirt.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's not their particular uniform, white shirts usually mean like administrative capacity.
Yeah.
So
Okay, so it could be him.
That would make sense. It could be him. Yep.
Okay, so after this influx of coverage, authorities had gotten some leads and additional calls as the public had gotten reinterested in the case after so many years. And Tara herself said she was getting a lot of messages from people, and she said it was really nice that this was happening because she hadn't really remembered or known much about her mother, and through these people reaching out, she was learning a lot about her. So John, I'm sure by this point, you're like, all right, Britt, you told us ages ago you were gonna get into the details on the on-again, off-again boyfriend, the father of Elizabeth's daughter. And now's the time where we're gonna circle back to that. So I didn't want to give, too much information about him until we were about to really get into theories, and the details, honestly, a lot of them were released in 2013. So I wanted to keep it kind of chronological because I didn't know really anything about him until I got to this point. So let's back up to something I think I told you probably within like the first 5 minutes, maybe even less than that of this episode. And that's that Elizabeth had been on a leave of absence from work prior to her going missing. And the Thursday that she disappeared was the first shift she'd taken since being out. Well, it was reported that she was actually out of work for a head injury, and that back in 1977, she'd been in an abusive relationship.
Interesting to know that her skull had damage to it consistent with some type of
Head
blunt force
injury.
trauma.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's also something else, and I have only seen this mentioned in one place. I cannot verify it anywhere else.
Tell me that this guy's not from Hawkins Hollow.
Oh, no, he actually
Okay.
wasn't. But on the Crime Watch Pennsylvania's write-up on this case, it specifically states that Elizabeth's boyfriend at the time was the main suspect in her case.
And this only became apparent in 2013?
Information about him became apparent in 2013.
So that's the guy that Berkovich was probably referring to when trying to convene the grand jury.
Possibly. So I want to take that information with a grain of salt because, like I said, I didn't find anything in initial reporting that said that he was a suspect. Detectives today have not named any sort of suspect. They haven't named a person of interest. That's literally the only place I've seen it. But there was something else about him that was mentioned pretty early on in reporting on this case, and it was actually something that Elizabeth's father had mentioned to the press. And he said at one point that his daughter had told both of her parents that she'd seen her ex the previous Wednesday. And I interpreted that as the Wednesday before her disappearance. And this is the exact comment according to reporting done in the Pittsburgh Press back in 1977. It stated, quote, "She told us she saw him again last Wednesday, but he denies it," end quote.
Okay, that's telling.
Yes.
My only question is, when she says that she saw him, did she see him in passing, or did they meet up and they saw each other?
I feel like it's insinuated that they met up, but I'm not 100% positive on that.
Or did she see him skulking in a dark alley watching her as she went and did something like leaving from work or something. Like what
That
is,
I'm not sure.
Right, that's my question though.
Yeah.
What is the meaning behind she saw him?
This is true. Yep. Okay. I see what you're saying. But then
let's
it also,
say they did meet and they saw each other.
Yeah. What if she told him that she was going on a date the next day?
Is that something that you would want to tell your abusive ex-boyfriend? It's something that maybe if he had pissed
Maybe
you
she
off,
wanted to piss him off in the moment.
Right.
She was like, screw you, man, for what you're doing. Guess what?
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a date with a way nicer guy than you.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'd do it.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Like, the only way I could think of somebody relinquishing that information to an abusive ex is if you're trying to piss them off because you get into some type of argument or whatever.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, you'll never find anybody better than me. I'm the only one here, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, yeah, well, screw you. I already have a date on Friday night.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe he still has that key. Maybe he makes his way in. He's lying in wait.
Mm-hmm. Or like he knew where a key was hidden, maybe. She could have had one under like a plant or who knows.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's more likely someone that was close to her than someone that wasn't. And also, I do want to say it was reported that authorities did question him in the beginning. And then after her skull had been found in May of 78, they tried to get him in for additional questioning. But I guess at the time he had been in Florida. And the reporting on that was kind of wishy-washy, with two different statements made that he'd either relocated to Florida or that he'd just been on vacation. But I do believe he was re-questioned after coming back up to Pennsylvania a short time after her skull was located. But regardless, I think him having left the area, whether it be for a short time or more permanently, is just very reminiscent of those post-offense behaviors we talk about often.
Definitely. And shame on me if I make this statement and it's not true, but we have definitely had suspects in Pennsylvania cases flee to Florida before. And what the hell? Like, we always hear about Florida man. What about Pennsylvania man?
Honestly, it's so true. It's
and
so
why is
true.
Pennsylvania man fleeing to Florida?
I don't know.
What the hell is the connection between the two?
I don't know.
But back to what you were saying, post-defense behavior, you know the police are already interested in speaking with you. You know that you are inevitably connected to this case because you are the ex-boyfriend, whatever,
Father
baby
of
daddy.
her child,
right.
yeah.
So, strange, yeah. You want to remove yourself from it. You want to try and get away.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes sense, and it goes back to very early on in the episode when, yeah, sure, I'm interested in the guy that she was supposed to have a date with that night first, but then really you think about all the facts and circumstances around the scene, who would have had access to that apartment? Not him. Like, this guy she's going to go out on a date with probably doesn't have a key to get into the apartment without forced entry and lay in wait, if that truly ended up being the scenario.
Yeah.
The ex-boyfriend would.
Yes, and to touch on the date one last time, too, I want to tell you that it was reported that he was, quote, virtually cleared of any connection with her disappearance, end quote.
Which makes sense, and I assume then he must have had some type of alibi. Yes, he said that he canceled the date. Maybe there was a message left on the answering machine that they could still listen to. Or maybe he just had a rock-solid alibi and he picked up an extra shift at work or something of that nature.
Yeah. So pretty much, I mean, I think we kind of were talking about the really only theory in the case, so...
Knowing that we've only had really 2 potential suspects this whole time, in my opinion, if one of them has been virtually ruled out of having any wrongdoing in her disappearance or death, you can only be left with the other person if there's only 2.
Agreed, yeah.
Maybe there's a third that we just haven't heard about, but until that's revealed, you can only be left with one answer.
Yeah, it seems unlikely unless they have like this sneaky little thing up their sleeve that they haven't said anything about. But here's the thing about this case is I really don't know in terms of forensic evidence or anything that they might have gathered from the car or the apartment or anything, because it seems like the big thing that everyone says is someone has to talk. Someone has to come forward with what they know. Someone needs to confess. Someone needs to provide a tip to police that can lead them in the right direction. So I feel like they need someone that might know something to come forward more than being able to use any other potential evidence they have to nail whoever it is that did this.
I mean, it would make sense because if you had Berkovich and he was, gung-ho about trying to bring whoever was responsible for this crime to justice, and maybe he came forward with all the stuff that they actually have, and he thought that it was enough, But then somebody was like, no, we need more. And it turns out that you need somebody to actually talk.
Mm-hmm. A witness or something.
He may have had all the information that they currently have, and they're still waiting for that person to come forward to talk. I don't know.
And I think that's where it's so wild to know that, like, this case was not talked about for almost 30 years.
Right. It hasn't been talked about for almost 30 years, and you really only have 2 suspects.
Yeah, and it's been like another decade now. 2013 was really the last big media coverage on this case. Like, this needs to be out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is an old case. This is 45 years old now, and people aren't getting any younger.
Right, and you had an investigator that was willing to bring this to a grand jury, and it ended up being shot down. It's like somebody thought that there was enough here to at least go forward with charges. I don't know. It's so wild that it feels like, just based on how you've told the story, that there were probably like 3 or 4 spurts of information over the course of, 45 years.
Yeah, and I just hope that renewed interest in the case again could maybe spark someone to finally speak up, especially now that they might be getting older and not really have anything to lose.
Yeah.
Elizabeth's parents died without ever knowing who killed their daughter, but Tara is still alive and deserves to know who stole her mother from her over 45 years ago. Tara put it perfectly in an interview she did back in 2013. Quote, "The problem with something like this is it never stays hidden forever. Eventually, the truth will come out. It won't be all of it, but it will be enough." If you have any information regarding who killed Elizabeth Berquist in December of 1977, please contact the state police at Uniontown at 724-439-7111, and please know that the Fayette County Crime Stoppers is offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in Elizabeth's case. And you can also reach out to them to provide a tip at 888-404-TIPS. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at WickedDeedsPod and on Twitter at WickedDeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.